Hey guys, tonight, before we fall asleep, let's take a quiet step backward into the medieval world, a world where nighttime felt very different from today. No glowing screens, no electric lights, and very little separation between darkness and silence. As evening arrived, people began preparing for bed in ways that might seem surprisingly strange to us now. Some warmed stones near the fire before sleeping, others shared beds with family members, friends, or even animals. Simply to stay warm through the cold night, prayers were whispered softly in candlelight, heavy curtains were drawn tightly around wooden beds, and many people believed the night itself carried unseen dangers. Not all bedtime rituals were practical. Some were superstitious, some deeply uncomfortable, and some oddly familiar. Before we continue, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe if you enjoy these calm journeys through history, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always strangely comforting seeing people gathering here from all around the world. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable beneath your blankets, and let's slowly explore the strange things medieval people did before going to bed. The final light of evening faded slowly across the medieval village. For a few quiet moments, the sky glowed deep blue above crooked rooftops and narrow dirt roads. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys into the cooling air. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang softly across the fields, warning everyone that night was arriving. And in medieval times, night was something people truly respected. Today, darkness is easy to ignore. A single switch can flood an entire room with light. Cities never truly sleep. Roads shine endlessly beneath lamps and glowing signs, but centuries ago, darkness felt alive. Once the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, the world changed completely. Familiar roads became uncertain paths. Forests became endless black walls. Even small homes, moments earlier filled with movement and conversation, suddenly grew quieter beneath flickering candlelight. People moved differently at night. They spoke more softly, locked doors more carefully, listened more closely to every sound outside. Because once darkness settled over the land, medieval people knew they were vulnerable. In wealthier homes, servants hurried through evening chores before visibility disappeared completely. Wooden shutters were closed tightly against the cold air. Candles were trimmed carefully to preserve expensive wax. Every flame mattered. In poorer cottages, families gathered close together near the fire before the warmth faded. The walls of their homes were often thin, built from rough timber and packed mud. Wind slipped easily through cracks. Rain tapped softly through weak patches in the roof. Outside, animals shifted in barns nearby. Horses stomped against straw. Dogs barked into the distance at things no one could see. And beyond the village, there was almost nothing but darkness. No streetlights, no distant highways, no comforting glow on the horizon, only forests, fields, empty roads, and silence. For many medieval people, nighttime carried uncertainty that modern life has almost completely erased. Travelers feared becoming stranded after sunset. Even short journeys could become dangerous beneath moonlight. Roads were uneven and difficult to follow. Thieves sometimes waited along isolated paths. Wild animals moved through forests at night. Wolves still existed in parts of Europe during the Middle Ages, their distant howls occasionally reaching villages during winter. Inside homes, the atmosphere slowly shifted as bedtime approached. The fire became the center of everything. Families cooked their final meal over glowing embers while shadows stretched along the walls. Iron pots crackled gently above flames. The smell of smoke clung to clothing, blankets, hair, and wooden furniture. Children grew sleepy listening to adult conversations they barely understood. Some homes remained crowded and noisy well into the evening. Others became strangely silent. In monasteries, monks followed strict nighttime routines. Candles flickered inside stone corridors while footsteps echoed softly through ancient halls. Prayers were whispered before sleep beneath towering wooden beams blackened by centuries of smoke. In castles, servants carried lanterns through long passageways while noble families prepared for bed behind heavy curtains and carved wooden doors. Yet no matter how rich or poor someone was, night eventually forced everyone into the same darkness, and darkness in medieval times could feel deeply personal. Without constant noise or artificial light, people noticed things modern minds rarely experience anymore. The creaking of timber. The sound of rain dripping into buckets, wind pushing softly against shutters, a distant cough from another room, the faint breathing of sleeping family members nearby. Sometimes, lying awake in near-total darkness, people became intensely aware of how fragile life truly was. Disease was common. Winters were harsh. Fires could destroy homes within minutes. Many people never traveled far beyond their village during their entire lives, and at night, with distractions gone, fears often became louder. Some feared evil spirits, others feared dying in their sleep, some simply feared what might be waiting outside the door. Yet despite all this uncertainty, medieval nights also carried a strange kind of calm. The world slowed naturally with the setting sun. People rested because darkness demanded it. Conversation softened. Fires dimmed. Entire villages gradually surrendered themselves to sleep beneath cold stars, and somewhere in that deep medieval silence, surrounded by flickering candlelight and heavy shadows, the long rituals of bedtime were only just beginning. The last traces of daylight disappeared slowly beyond the fields. For a few lingering moments, the western sky still carried a dim silver glow, but inside the village, evening had already begun settling into every corner of life. Shadows stretched longer across wooden floors. Fires crackled lower inside stone hearths. And throughout the narrow winding streets, medieval families quietly began preparing themselves for darkness, not simply for sleep, but for survival through the night, because in medieval times, darkness was not something that arrived gently, it consumed the world completely. Inside a small timber house near the edge of the village, a woman carefully crossed the room carrying a single candle cupped in her hand. The flame trembled with each movement, throwing soft golden light against rough walls blackened by years of smoke. Candles were precious. Many poorer families could not afford to waste them freely, especially during winter when nights stretched endlessly across the land. Some homes relied almost entirely on the fireplace for light after sunset. Others used small oil lamps that filled rooms with faint smells of animal fat and smoke, so before night fully arrived, every task had to be completed carefully and efficiently. Water was carried indoors, animals were secured, doors were reinforced, tools were gathered, because once darkness settled over the village, people preferred not to step outside again. Across medieval Europe, homes were rarely comfortable by modern standards. Most cottages were small, crowded, and vulnerable to cold weather. Tiny gaps between wooden boards allowed wind to slip inside constantly. Roofs sometimes leaked during rainstorms. Floors were often made of packed earth scattered with straw, and yet despite these hardships, evening preparations followed rhythms repeated almost every night for generations. The routines became deeply familiar. Comforting, even, a father checked the wooden latch on the front door twice before lowering a heavy beam across it. Nearby, his youngest son stacked extra firewood beside the hearth while sparks drifted upward into the darkness above. Outside, the sounds of the village slowly changed. The hammering of blacksmiths stopped, market voices disappeared, Cartwheels no longer rattled along the road. Instead, softer sounds replaced them. Dogs barking in the distance, wind brushing through trees, the low murmur of families speaking quietly indoors, in wealthier homes. Servants moved from room to room, preparing chambers for the night ahead. Thick curtains were drawn over windows to keep out drafts. Bed linens were shaken clean. Candlesticks were trimmed carefully to make them last longer through the evening. Some noble households even scattered fragrant herbs across bedroom floors: lavender, rosemary, chamomile, not only for pleasant smells, but because medieval people believed strong herbs could help protect homes from illness and unseen dangers drifting through the night air. And in truth, nighttime often carried real risks. Fire was perhaps the greatest fear of all. Most homes were built largely from wood. Roofs were commonly thatched with dry straw. One overturned candle could destroy an entire row of houses before sunrise, so every evening, flames had to be managed carefully. Some families covered embers with ash before sleeping to preserve heat safely through the night. Others kept small controlled fires glowing until morning. In monasteries and castles, servants sometimes remained awake specifically to watch for signs of accidental fire. The responsibility of preparing the home for darkness was taken seriously because there were few second chances once night began. Meanwhile, in poorer rural cottages, animals were often brought astonishingly close to human living spaces after sunset. Chickens settled into corners, dogs curled near fires. Sometimes even goats or pigs remained under the same roof during severe cold weather. To modern minds, this sounds unpleasant. But in medieval life, warmth mattered more than comfort. The body heat of animals could help a family survive freezing nights when winter winds pushed through fragile walls, and as darkness deepened outside, homes became smaller worlds unto themselves. The firelight flickered gently across faces, shadows danced against ceiling beams, simple conversations filled the room while people finished repairing clothes, mending tools, or preparing food for the following day. There was no endless entertainment to distract them, no glowing screens, no electric noise humming through walls, only the soft rhythm of human voices surrounded by darkness. And strangely, many medieval nights may have felt calmer because of it. People accepted that nighttime demanded stillness. The world naturally slowed. Even wealthy castles eventually quieted after enough candles burned low. Stone corridors emptied. Servants disappeared into sleeping quarters. Only distant footsteps and faint torchlight remained awake inside enormous halls. Outside, moonlight spread silently across empty roads and frozen fields. Travel became rare now. Most people stayed exactly where they were until morning. The night belonged to uncertainty, to silence, to imagination. Back inside the cottage near the village edge, the woman carefully hung a thick wool blanket across the doorway to block cold drafts from entering. Her husband stirred the embers one final time before sitting heavily beside the fire. Their children were already growing sleepy. One rubbed tired eyes while staring quietly into the glowing coals. Another listened to the wind outside with nervous curiosity, because children in medieval times learned early that darkness carried mysteries adults could never fully explain. Some believed spirits wandered after sunset, others feared witches, demons, or strange creatures hidden beyond the safety of candlelight. And although many of these fears sound distant now, the darkness itself was very real. When the final candle was finally extinguished, entire homes disappeared into near total blackness. No soft electronic lights remained glowing, no distant city brightness reached the countryside. Only the faint orange breathing of the fire, and the endless medieval night waiting patiently beyond the walls. Tomorrow, the rituals before sleep would grow even stranger. By the middle of the afternoon, steam sometimes drifted through certain medieval streets in soft white clouds, behind wooden doors marked by painted signs. People gathered in bathhouses, and contrary to the popular image of the permanently unwashed Middle Ages, bathing was not unknown at all. In fact, many medieval towns across Europe once supported thriving public baths. Some were simple, others surprisingly elaborate. Inside, heated water filled large tubs while attendants carried buckets between rooms thick with warmth and conversation. Candles flickered against damp wooden walls. Herbs floated gently across the water's surface for a brief moment. The cold world outside disappeared. The tradition partly survived from ancient Roman bathing culture. Though the massive stone bath complexes of the Roman Empire had faded centuries earlier, smaller bathhouses continued operating in many regions. Travelers, merchants, laborers, and even nobles visited them, not daily perhaps, but often enough to make bathing an ordinary part of medieval urban life. Some bathhouses offered private tubs, others contained shared bathing spaces where people soaked, talked, ate, and relaxed together. In certain cities, baths became social centers almost as much as places of hygiene, and naturally, this created controversy. Religious leaders sometimes worried that bathhouses encouraged sinful behavior. Rumors spread easily through crowded towns. Stories of secret meetings, gambling, drinking, and romance followed many bathhouses wherever they appeared. Yet despite criticism, people kept going, because warm water offered something precious: relief. Imagine spending weeks surrounded by mud, smoke, animals, and hard labor. Then suddenly stepping into a heated room scented faintly with herbs and soap. The experience must have felt almost luxurious. Even peasants occasionally bathed in rivers during summer months. Children splashed in streams beneath open skies while washerwomen cleaned clothing nearby. In warmer seasons, nature itself became part of medieval hygiene. Winter, however, changed everything. Cold temperatures made bathing difficult and sometimes dangerous. Heating enough water required tremendous effort. Firewood was expensive. Large tubs had to be filled manually. For many households, full bathing became occasional rather than regular. Still, smaller cleaning routines continued. Hands, faces, feet, hair. People focused on manageable tasks rather than complete immersion. Soap existed too, though not in the modern form people imagine today. Medieval soaps were often harsh mixtures made from animal fat and ashes. Some smelled strongly of smoke or lye. Wealthier versions included oils or perfumes, and bathhouses themselves varied greatly. One might be clean and orderly, another overcrowded and unpleasant. Water was not always replaced frequently enough. Shared tubs carried obvious risks, even if medieval people did not fully understand disease transmission. Then came plague. During outbreaks of illness, fear transformed public attitudes toward bathing. Some physicians began warning that hot baths opened the pores, allowing sickness to enter the body more easily. Public bathhouses gradually lost popularity in many regions after devastating epidemics swept through Europe. What once symbolized comfort began to feel dangerous. And slowly, habits changed, but during the height of medieval bath culture, these places remained strangely human. Picture tired travelers warming themselves beside steaming tubs while snow falls quietly outside. Picture candlelight reflecting across water. Picture conversations drifting softly through humid rooms while attendants carry fresh towels woven from rough linen. For a little while, the hardships of medieval life softened. Yet even these moments of comfort revealed deep divisions between rich and poor. A noblewoman might bathe in privacy surrounded by scented oils. A laborer might share cloudy water with strangers after days of exhausting work. Still, both sought the same thing: cleanliness, warmth, relief from the heaviness of ordinary life. And as evening settled over medieval towns, bathhouse doors slowly closed. Steam faded into cold night air. Lanterns dimmed. Beyond the city walls, forests stretched silently beneath moonlight. Inside homes, people returned once again to smaller routines of washing and survival, but another mystery waited quietly beside every basin and bath, because even when water was available, one important question remained: what exactly were medieval people using to clean themselves? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the strange, gritty reality of medieval soap itself. As night slowly settled over the medieval world, privacy became a luxury few people could afford. The fire dimmed, the cold deepened, and inside homes across villages, towns, monasteries, and castles alike, people gathered together not for conversation, but for warmth, because in medieval times, sleep was rarely solitary. Beds were shared, rooms were shared, sometimes entire lives were shared within a single crowded space where darkness softened the edges of exhaustion but never fully erased discomfort. Inside peasant cottages, the sleeping arrangement was often simple. A single room served nearly every purpose imaginable: cooking, eating, working, storing tools, caring for animals during harsh weather, and eventually sleeping. At night, straw mattresses were pulled closer to the hearth while embers still glowed faintly beneath layers of ash. Families slept side by side beneath rough wool blankets heavy with smoke and winter dampness. Children curled beside parents, grandparents rested nearby. Sometimes servants or distant relatives shared the same room entirely, not because intimacy was desired, but because survival demanded closeness. Heat disappeared quickly after midnight. Stone floors radiated cold upward through wooden frames and thin bedding. Shared body warmth became one of the few reliable defenses against freezing temperatures, and strangely, for medieval people, this closeness often felt normal, comforting, even. The modern expectation of private bedrooms simply did not exist for most households. Sleep itself was communal. The sounds of breathing, shifting blankets, crackling firewood, and distant wind through wooden walls blended together into the ordinary atmosphere of night. Yet shared sleeping also brought difficulties. Illness spread easily through crowded beds. Fleas and lice moved quietly between blankets and clothing. Smoke from indoor fires lingered in enclosed spaces long after flames disappeared, settling into fabric, straw, and lungs alike. Still, people adapted. Beds in poorer homes were often built from simple wooden frames stuffed with straw, hay, or dried grasses. Over time, these materials flattened, collected moisture, and required replacement. Wealthier households sometimes used feather mattresses, linen sheets, and heavier curtains to trap warmth around the bed itself, but even castles remained far colder than modern audiences imagine. Drafts slipped constantly through stone corridors and narrow windows. Nobles often slept beneath layers of blankets while servants prepared warming pans filled with hot coals to briefly heat sheets before bedtime. Warmth was precious at every level of society, and beds reflected status clearly. A noble bed could become an elaborate piece of furniture, carved wood, embroidered fabric, curtains surrounding the sleeper like a private chamber within a larger room. Yet even these grand beds were not always private. Servants slept nearby, guards remained close. Travelers, guests, attendants, and family members frequently occupied shared spaces inside great halls and castle chambers. Complete solitude at night remained rare. In monasteries, sleeping carried its own rhythm entirely. Rows of monks rested together inside long communal dormitories beneath dim candlelight and silence. Beds remained modest. Privacy remained limited. Sleep itself was treated almost as discipline rather than comfort. Even kings experienced interruptions throughout the night. Medieval sleep patterns often differed from modern schedules. Many people woke briefly during darkness, tending fires, praying, checking animals, or speaking quietly before returning to rest. Night unfolded slowly, not as uninterrupted sleep, but as a softer cycle between waking and dreaming, and beyond physical discomforts, darkness itself shaped medieval sleep deeply. Without electric light, the night felt vast, heavy, almost alive. Outside cottage walls, wolves howled in distant forests. Wind rattled shutters. Rain struck rooftops endlessly during storms. Travelers caught on roads after sunset often searched desperately for shelter before true darkness arrived. Inside crowded sleeping spaces, people found reassurance simply in hearing others nearby. A shared room meant protection. Isolation could feel dangerous. Even inns reflected this reality. Travelers frequently shared beds with strangers when space ran short. Privacy mattered far less than safety and warmth. Candlelight flickered across exhausted faces while muddy boots dried near fires and unfamiliar breathing filled the darkness, and somehow, medieval people endured this constant closeness with remarkable acceptance, because their world demanded adaptation more than comfort. The body learned to rest despite noise, the mind learned to sleep despite smoke, cold, insects, and crowded conditions. And perhaps that quiet endurance reveals something strangely human beneath the discomfort. People did not wait for perfect conditions to find rest, they simply rested where they could. Beside family, beside strangers, beside fading fires inside fragile homes surrounded by darkness. As midnight deepened over the medieval world, entire households slept beneath rough blankets while smoke drifted slowly toward timber rafters overhead. Tomorrow would arrive early again, more labor, more cold, more survival, but for now, in the dim quiet between embers and dawn, shared warmth was enough. Long before electric blankets, before central heating, before warm air quietly flowed through hidden vents behind modern walls, medieval nights belonged to the cold. Not the gentle cold of a winter walk beneath streetlights, but a heavier cold, a living cold that crept slowly through stone walls, under wooden doors, across dirt floors, and into blankets long after the fire began to fade. And in that world, warmth became something people prepared for carefully each evening, one small ritual at a time. As darkness settled over homes and castles alike, fires crackled low inside hearths while families began the slow process of readying themselves for sleep. The final chores of the day faded into silence. Animals quieted outside. Smoke drifted lazily upward into rafters blackened by years of soot. Then came the warming stones, simple objects, heavy pieces of stone or brick placed near open flames until heat slowly spread through their center. Sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes tucked beneath blankets, sometimes carried carefully through dark rooms with thick gloves or folded fabric protecting tired hands from burns. The idea was not comfort in the modern sense, it was survival. Beds in medieval times trapped cold with astonishing efficiency. Straw mattresses absorbed dampness from the air. Linen sheets chilled quickly after sunset. Even wealthy homes struggled against winter temperatures that crept relentlessly indoors through cracks in walls and windows. So before sleep, warmth had to be created manually. In peasant cottages, stones heated beside the hearth became precious sources of temporary comfort. Children waited patiently while parents rotated worn stones beneath blankets or near feet where the cold felt strongest, for a few brief hours. The bed softened, not warm exactly, but less cruel. The heat faded slowly into the darkness while wind rattled outside wooden walls. And somehow, that small warmth changed everything. In castles and noble households, warming methods became slightly more elaborate. Metal warming pans filled with glowing coals were slid carefully between sheets before bedtime. Servants moved quietly through corridors carrying these long-handled tools while candlelight flickered against stone walls, but even there, The cold remained powerful. Large stone chambers trapped winter air long after fireplaces dimmed. Heavy curtains around beds helped contain warmth, creating small islands of heat within otherwise freezing rooms. The medieval world never fully escaped nature, it negotiated with it, and warming stones were part of that negotiation. Some households used smooth river stones because they retained heat longer. Others relied on bricks heated near ovens after bread baking finished for the evening. In rural regions, heated clay containers sometimes replaced stone entirely depending on local traditions. Every community adapted differently, but the purpose remained the same: to make sleep possible. Because exhaustion alone did not guarantee rest, cold could wake people repeatedly through the night. Frozen feet, stiff hands, and damp bedding made deep sleep difficult during harsh winters. Families often huddled together beneath layers of blankets not simply for affection, but because shared warmth mattered physically. And strangely enough, the preparation for sleep itself became calming, predictable, a nightly rhythm repeated across centuries: heat the stones, prepare the bed, bank the fire, close the shutters, listen to the wind outside, then slowly settle into darkness. For medieval children, these rituals likely became deeply familiar memories: the glow of embers against walls, the scent of smoke trapped in blankets, the careful placement of warm stones beneath heavy covers before drifting toward sleep. Even travelers carried versions of this practice wherever possible. At roadside inns during winter journeys, innkeepers sometimes provided heated bricks or warmed cloth bundles to paying guests. Travelers arriving soaked from snow or rain often sat close to fires waiting desperately for some warmth to return to their hands before bed. The road at night could feel mercilessly cold, and warmth, however temporary, felt almost sacred. Yet warming stones also carried danger. Overheated stones occasionally cracked unexpectedly. Poorly wrapped heating bricks could scorch bedding or start fires if left too close to straw mattresses. Metal warming pans filled with live coals demanded careful handling in crowded wooden homes already vulnerable to fire. Everything required balance: too little heat invited suffering, too much risked disaster, and still, medieval people repeated these routines night after night because the alternative was worse: to climb into freezing bedding after hours of labor beneath cold skies, without even a small pocket of warmth waiting, would have felt unbearable. As midnight approached, the heated stones slowly cooled beneath blankets while entire households drifted toward uneasy sleep. Outside, frost spread silently across fields and rooftops beneath moonlight. Inside, fading warmth lingered just long enough, a temporary victory against winter darkness, and somewhere beyond those quiet sleeping rooms, another medieval struggle waited patiently in the shadows, because even warm beds carried unwelcome companions, tiny creatures hiding deep inside straw mattresses and blankets, waiting for nightfall to truly begin. When the last embers in the hearth began to sink into ash, and the house finally settled into darkness, medieval nights did not simply end, they transformed, because before sleep came fully, there was still a moment that belonged to something deeper than comfort, deeper than warmth, and even deeper than exhaustion, a quiet pause between the day that had passed and the unknown that would follow. For many medieval people, this was the moment of prayer, not always loud, not always formal, often simple, almost whispered into the stillness of a dim room where only faint light from dying coals remained. In peasant homes, families would gather one final time near the hearth. Some would kneel on rough wooden floors. Others would remain standing, heads bowed slightly, hands clasped or resting gently in front of them. The youngest children often imitated the adults without fully understanding the words, simply absorbing the rhythm of it all. It was not a performance, it was routine, a way of closing the day. Outside, wind pressed softly against wooden shutters. Animals shifted in their sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. But inside, everything narrowed into a smaller world of stillness and reflection. People prayed for safety, for health, for harvests that had not yet failed, for travelers still on the road, for children already asleep beside them. And sometimes, for nothing in particular at all. Just a quiet acknowledgement that another day had passed through uncertain hands. In monasteries, nighttime rituals followed a far more structured rhythm. The final prayers of the day echoed through stone corridors, where monks moved slowly in dim candlelight, their footsteps absorbed by thick walls that had heard centuries of repetition. The language of prayer filled cold halls that felt almost timeless. There, the night was not only rest, but discipline, a cycle carefully maintained between work, reflection, and silence. Even kings and nobles, despite their wealth and layered comfort, often ended their evenings with structured devotion. In large chambers lit by candles, prayers were said beside ornate beds draped in heavy fabric. Servants waited quietly outside doors while rulers observed their own routines of reflection. But regardless of status, the feeling remained similar, a pause before sleep, a recognition of uncertainty, because medieval nights carried a sense of vulnerability modern life rarely mirrors in the same way. Darkness was not softened by artificial light. It was complete, expansive. It pressed against the boundaries of homes and minds alike, and so rituals developed not only for faith, but for reassurance. Some people crossed themselves before lying down, others repeated familiar phrases learned from parents long ago, some recited short prayers in silence while staring at the glow of fading embers, and some simply sat for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of their environment before allowing sleep to take over. These actions were not always formal religious acts in the strict sense. They were habits of the mind, ways of settling fear, ways of acknowledging uncertainty, ways of creating a sense of order in a world that often felt unpredictable. Even children learned these rhythms early. Bedtime stories sometimes blended with prayers. Simple verses repeated until they became part of memory rather than thought. In this way, nighttime became a shared emotional space across generations. As candles burned lower, shadows stretched across stone walls and wooden beams. Faces softened in the dim glow. Voices lowered until they became almost indistinguishable from silence itself, and then, gradually, the house fell still, not suddenly, but slowly. Like breath easing into sleep, outside, the medieval world continued its own quiet life. Guards remained at gates. Travelers moved carefully along roads where visibility disappeared entirely after dark. Rivers flowed unseen beneath night skies. Forests stood heavy and unmoving under stars that provided beauty, but not safety, and within homes, people trusted their rituals to carry them through the unknown hours ahead, because prayer, in many ways, was not only about belief. It was about release, a final letting go of the day's burdens before surrendering consciousness to sleep. Even those who could not fully explain their beliefs still followed the pattern. The act itself mattered as much as the meaning behind it, a gesture toward calm, a moment of control in an uncontrollable world. And once the final words faded into silence, there was nothing left to do but lie down, pull blankets close, and accept the night. Sometimes sleep came quickly, sometimes it lingered at the edges, delayed by thoughts, cold, or distant sounds. When the last candle was extinguished, and the final ember in the hearth collapsed into ash, the medieval world did not simply become dark, it became unknown, and for many people, that was far more unsettling than the absence of light itself. Night in the Middle Ages was not softened by electric glow or distant city illumination. It arrived fully, completely, Like a curtain drawn across the world with no small cracks left open, inside homes, people could still feel their surroundings, the wooden beams above, the rough walls, the cold air seeping through gaps in stone or timber. But what lay beyond those walls became something imagined rather than seen, an imagination, in the dark. Often grew louder than reason, fires provided the only true boundary between safety and uncertainty. As long as flames flickered, shadows remained contained, shaped, and familiar. But when fire faded, even the most ordinary room could feel different. Unfamiliar. Slightly changed in ways the mind struggled to explain. People in medieval times were deeply aware of this transformation. They did not see darkness as empty, they saw it as active, a space where things moved without being seen. Outside villages, forests became vast and unreadable after sunset. Trees that felt ordinary during the day turned into dense silhouettes at night, their shapes merging into one another until paths seemed to disappear entirely. Travelers understood this danger well. Few moved willingly after nightfall. Roads that were safe in daylight became uncertain, their edges lost in darkness. Even familiar routes could feel altered when visibility vanished, and so people adapted. They stayed indoors, they closed shutters tightly, they kept fires burning longer than necessary, even if wood was scarce, not only for warmth, but for reassurance. Inside homes, shadows stretched and shifted across walls as flames weakened. Every movement of light created shapes that seemed almost alive. A hanging coat might resemble a standing figure. A stack of tools might appear briefly unfamiliar in flickering illumination. The mind filled gaps that sight could not, and in those gaps, fear often took shape. This was not irrational fear in the modern sense. It was practical awareness shaped by experience. Night brought real dangers in medieval life, wild animals near settlements, thieves on unlit roads, accidents in unfamiliar spaces, sudden illness without immediate help, and the simple difficulty of navigating uneven ground without light. So caution became instinct. People learned to listen more carefully after dark. A creak in wood, a shift in wind, a distant sound that could not be identified immediately. Each detail mattered more when vision was limited. Even inside homes, movement slowed at night. Steps were measured carefully to avoid injury. Objects were kept in familiar places so they could be found by memory rather than sight, but beyond practical concerns. There was also belief. In many regions, night carried spiritual associations. The darkness was sometimes thought of as a time when boundaries between the seen and unseen world felt thinner. Stories and tradition spoke of spirits, wandering figures, or forces that became more present when daylight disappeared. Whether people fully believed these ideas or simply respected them, they influenced behavior. Children were often reminded not to wander at night. Doors were locked earlier than they might be today, and prayers or rituals before sleep sometimes included requests for protection through the hours of darkness. Yet despite these fears, life did not stop at sunset, it simply narrowed. Slower rhythms replaced daytime activity. Quiet tasks continued near hearths. Repair work, storytelling, and preparation for the next day filled the remaining hours before sleep. Even fear itself became routine, familiar, predictable in its unpredictability, and perhaps that familiarity is what softened it over time. Because medieval people lived with darkness every day of their lives, they learned its patterns, its sounds, its silence. They understood that night was not an interruption of life, but part of its cycle. Still, there were moments when fear felt stronger than routine, a sudden storm that swallowed moonlight, a forest path that seemed too quiet, a distant sound that could not be placed. In those moments, imagination filled the space left by uncertainty, and the world felt larger than it was during daylight. Inside homes, people often gathered closer together during such nights. Shared presence reduced fear. The sound of breathing, the warmth of nearby bodies, the faint glow of embers, all of it created a fragile sense of safety. Even animals reacted to night differently. Dogs barked at unseen movement. Livestock shifted uneasily in barns. Birds fell silent completely, as if the world itself paused until morning returned. And yet, despite all of this, medieval nights always ended the same way. Gradually, without announcement, darkness softened as faint light returned to the horizon. Shapes regained clarity. Sounds became ordinary again. The world reassembled itself piece by piece as daylight took back control. Fear dissolved not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer necessary. As dawn approached, shutters opened. Fires were rekindled. People stepped outside once more into a world that had regained definition, and the night, so vast and uncertain just hours before, became something almost distant, almost unreal, but its memory lingered quietly, a reminder that in medieval life, darkness was never just absence of light. It was an experience, one that shaped how people moved, thought, and survived. And in the next chapter, we step into the fragile boundary between safety and illness, where water, waste, and hidden dangers shaped medieval hygiene in ways people could see, and ways they could only guess at. When daylight faded in the medieval world, homes did not become empty, silent structures. They became shared spaces, and among the most important, yet often overlooked, parts of medieval nighttime life were the animals that lived inside or very close to human sleeping areas, because in a world without central heating, insulated walls, or modern security, animals were not just livestock, they were warmth, protection, and sometimes necessity. As evening settled and fires burned low, people did something that might feel unusual today but was completely ordinary then. They brought animals closer. In many peasant homes, chickens, goats, and even small pigs were sometimes kept inside the lower areas of the house or in adjacent spaces during cold nights. Not always directly in the sleeping room, but close enough that their presence could be felt through sound, movement, and warmth. The reason was simple: cold was dangerous, animals generated body heat, and that heat, shared across enclosed spaces, could slightly raise the temperature of a home during freezing nights. The air inside medieval houses was never still for long. The soft shuffle of hooves on wooden floors, the rustle of feathers settling into corners, the occasional low sound of a restless animal shifting in sleep, these noises became part of the night itself, familiar, expected, not disturbing, but grounding. Dogs, in particular, held a special place in nighttime life. Often kept close to entrances or sleeping areas, they provided both companionship and security. Their ears responded to sounds humans could not hear. A distant movement outside, a shift in wind, the presence of something unfamiliar near the house. When dogs barked at night in medieval villages, people listened, not with panic always, but with attention, because sound mattered more in darkness than sight. Cats, too, moved quietly through these spaces. They were especially valued not only for companionship but for their role in controlling rodents. Grain storage was essential for survival, and mice or rats could quickly destroy months of food if left unchecked, so cats became silent partners in medieval households. They moved between shadows near hearths, climbing onto wooden beams or curling near warm ashes where heat still lingered. Even in sleep, they remained part of the household ecosystem, but animals were not always inside homes for comfort alone. Sometimes they were there because there was nowhere else safe enough. Winter storms could be severe. Snow, wind, and freezing rain made outdoor shelters dangerous or insufficient. Bringing animals indoors during such nights protected them from injury or death, which in turn protected the household's long-term survival, because losing animals meant losing food, labor, and economic stability. Every creature mattered. Inside castles and larger estates, animals also shared proximity with humans at night, though in more structured ways. Horses were typically kept in stables, but still close enough that their presence influenced the environment. The sound of movement in stables, the scent of hay and leather, and the occasional restless neigh traveled through stone walls into sleeping chambers. Even nobles were never fully separated from the living world around them. The medieval night was layered with life, not empty, not still, but quietly active in ways that modern buildings rarely experience. And this closeness between humans and animals also influenced daily hygiene. Smells mixed together: straw, fur, smoke, wood, and earth. Floors required regular cleaning when possible. Bedding had to be shaken out. Clothing absorbed scents that came from both human and animal life sharing the same enclosed environment, yet this was not seen as unusual, it was simply reality, a shared existence shaped by necessity. People learned to sleep through it, to adapt, to normalize the sounds and smells of animals moving through their world after dark. Even children grew up with this environment as their baseline understanding of home at night. A dog curling near the doorway. A cat settling near warm ash. A goat shifting in a corner space during a storm. These were not disruptions, they were part of comfort. Still, there were challenges. Animals could be restless. They could knock over objects in the dark. They could carry fleas or lice that sometimes transferred into human bedding. And their presence, while beneficial, also contributed to the complex reality of medieval hygiene and cleanliness, but removing them entirely was rarely an option. The cost was too high, so instead, people managed what they could, kept spaces as clean as possible, maintained bedding, stored food carefully, balanced human and animal needs within shared structures. As night deepened, homes became a quiet blend of breathing bodies, human and animal alike, resting within the same enclosed warmth. Fires faded, shadows grew softer, and movement slowed until everything settled into stillness. Yet even in sleep, life remained close, a dog shifting slightly, a cat adjusting its position, a distant animal call outside in the dark fields. These small sounds formed the background of medieval rest, not silence, but a living quiet, and as dawn eventually returned, animals would once again step fully into their roles, helping, working, guarding, and sustaining the fragile balance of daily medieval life. But for a few hours each night, they simply shared the home. And in that shared darkness, survival and companionship became the same thing. In the next chapter, we move into one of the most overlooked realities of medieval life at night, the hidden world of pests, insects, and the constant struggle to sleep peacefully despite them. In the medieval world, a bed was never just a place to sleep, it was a small enclosed world within a larger room. Sometimes even within a larger hall, and one of the most distinctive features of many medieval beds, especially in wealthier homes, was something that might seem simple at first glance: curtains, heavy fabric draped around wooden frames, forming a soft boundary between the sleeper and the rest of the room. At night, these curtains were drawn closed, and the bed became its own private space, dim, enclosed, and slightly removed from the world outside. Not fully separate, but softened in. Noble households and castles, beds with curtains were common. These were often large wooden structures, carved with detail and built to hold thick mattresses filled with feathers or wool. Above them, wooden canopies supported layers of fabric that could be drawn shut from all sides. When closed, the bed felt almost like a small chamber within a chamber, a world of its own. Inside that enclosed space, candlelight from the room outside became only a faint glow through fabric. Sounds were muted. Movement outside became distant. Even the cold air of stone walls was slightly reduced within the layered curtains. This was not modern privacy. It was something different, a sense of separation within shared space, because even in castles, bedrooms were not always private. Servants moved through chambers. Guards remained nearby. Family members or guests could be present in the same large room. Curtains created psychological space more than architectural isolation. For nobles, this mattered deeply. Sleep was vulnerable, night was unpredictable, and curtains offered a feeling of control in environments that were otherwise open and shared. In poorer homes, full curtain beds were rare. But simpler versions existed. Sometimes cloths or blankets were hung loosely around sleeping areas, especially during colder seasons or in homes where multiple people shared the same room. Even a partial barrier could make a difference. It helped block drafts, it reduced the feeling of being exposed in a crowded space, and it created a small illusion of privacy in an otherwise communal environment. The material of these curtains varied depending on wealth and availability. In noble homes, they might be made of dyed wool, linen, or imported fabrics with subtle patterns. In simpler households, they were often rough linen or even repurposed cloth sewn together for practical use. Over time, these bed curtains absorbed the scent of smoke, herbs, and human life. They were rarely washed frequently due to their size and weight, but they were maintained carefully, brushed, aired out, and repaired when needed. They became part of the bed itself, not separate from it. Inside the curtains, medieval sleep felt different. The outside world became less visible. Shadows no longer moved freely across walls. The bed became a contained environment where light, sound, and cold were slightly softened. For many people, especially in winter, this mattered more than anything else, because medieval nights were not just dark, they were physically present. Cold air pressed against every surface of a room. Wind moved through cracks in stone or timber. And without barriers, sleep could feel exposed. Curtains changed that experience. They did not eliminate discomfort, but they reduced it just enough to make rest possible. In some traditions, curtains also held symbolic meaning. They represented separation between rest and activity, between vulnerability and protection, between the outer world and the inner space of sleep. To draw the curtains at night was to close off the day. To open them in the morning was to re-enter the world again. In monasteries, beds were more modest, but similar ideas existed. Privacy was limited, yet simple partitions or spacing between beds created subtle boundaries. Sleep remained communal, but still structured. Even there, the idea of separation mattered, not physical isolation, but mental transition. Across all classes, beds with curtains reflected a deeper medieval understanding of rest, that sleep required not only physical warmth, but a sense of safety from the vast openness of night. And so every evening, the act of closing curtains became part of the rhythm of medieval life, a final gesture before sleep, a soft enclosure, a small act of control in a world that offered very little of it after sunset. Outside the bed, darkness remained wide and uncertain. Inside it, at least for a few hours, the world felt contained, and as candles dimmed and voices faded, the curtains of medieval beds slowly absorbed the last traces of light, until nothing remained but quiet breath and sleep. In the next chapter, we step into one of the most persistent companions of medieval nights, the hidden insects and pests that shared these beds with people, whether they were invited or not. Winter in the medieval world was not something you simply experienced, it was something you endured. As the sun disappeared earlier each day and the wind began to sharpen across fields and rooftops, night stretched longer, heavier, and colder than any other season. Inside homes, The warmth of the daytime fire never truly lasted, it faded too quickly. Stone walls absorbed heat and gave it back as cold. Wooden floors creaked with frost creeping inward. Even air inside small cottages felt different in winter, thicker, slower, as if the entire house was holding its breath against the season, and when it came time to sleep, the struggle truly began. Beds were never warm on their own. Straw mattresses, wool blankets, and linen sheets all carried the same problem: they could not generate heat. They could only preserve what little warmth already existed, so people learned to prepare carefully. Every evening became a quiet negotiation with the cold. Fires were kept burning longer than usual, even if wood supplies were limited. Families gathered closer together before sleep, sharing body heat beneath layers of rough fabric. Animals sometimes remained nearby for warmth, their presence adding a small but meaningful difference to the temperature of a room. And yet, even with all this effort, winter nights still cut deep. Inside peasant homes, people often slept in layers of clothing. Wool tunics, cloaks, and extra wraps were worn to bed simply to slow the loss of heat. Removing clothes entirely, something common in modern sleep, was often impractical in freezing conditions. The bed itself became a survival space rather than comfort space. Cold air would gather at floor level, so people sometimes elevated sleeping arrangements slightly or slept closer to the hearth where fading embers still released faint warmth into the room. But proximity to fire was not always safe or comfortable. Smoke lingered in enclosed spaces. Sparks could occasionally drift into bedding if the fire was not carefully controlled. And so families learned balance: close enough for warmth, far enough for safety. In wealthier households and castles, winter sleeping conditions were slightly better, but not free from hardship. Thick stone walls held cold for long periods, sometimes making large chambers feel even colder than small cottages. Nobles relied on heavier bedding, layered fabrics, and heated stones placed beneath blankets before sleep. Servants prepared beds carefully each night, warming them before the household retired. Even so, cold remained a constant presence in monasteries. Communal sleeping halls became especially difficult during winter months. Rows of beds lined stone walls where drafts slipped through unnoticed gaps. Monks often slept in simple wool garments, with little variation between night and day clothing, simply to maintain warmth. Across all social levels, winter reduced comfort to its simplest form: stay warm enough to sleep. That was the goal, nothing more. Outside, the world transformed completely. Fields became still and pale under frost. Rivers slowed at their edges. Roads hardened into uneven, icy paths. Even sound seemed different, muted, distant, as if winter itself softened everything it touched. Inside homes, this silence created its own atmosphere. Fire crackling softly, occasional shifting of blankets, the low murmur of people settling into sleep, but beneath that calm surface, the cold remained constant. It pressed against walls, seeped into floors, and waited patiently for any warmth to disappear. People often woke during the night simply because of temperature changes. As fires weakened and bodies cooled, sleep became lighter, interrupted by the need to adjust blankets or move closer to warmth. There was no uninterrupted comfort. Only cycles of warmth and cold. Still, medieval people adapted in ways that feel almost invisible today. They accepted winter as part of rhythm rather than interruption. They planned around it, prepared for it, and endured it with methods passed down through generations. Even small details mattered. Beds were made early so they could be warmed before use. Clothing was dried carefully near fires before sleep. Animals were positioned strategically for shared heat. Even sleeping positions within families were arranged based on warmth distribution. Everything became intentional, because in winter, nothing about sleep was accidental. And yet, despite the hardship, there was also a strange quietness to winter nights in medieval times. The world outside slowed down so much that indoor life felt more intimate. Conversations became softer. Movements more careful. Time itself seemed to stretch differently. In that stillness, sleep arrived not as comfort, but as necessity, a retreat from cold rather than a reward of rest. And as night deepened, entire households settled into layers of fabric, shared heat, and fading embers, holding on to warmth for as long as possible before it slipped away again, until morning, when fire would be rebuilt, and the cycle would begin once more, in the next chapter. We move from cold nights into something even more persistent and unavoidable in medieval sleep, the hidden world of insects and pests that shared every bed, whether people wanted them there or not. Before sleep arrived in the medieval world, it was rarely approached with pure simplicity. The act of lying down, closing one's eyes, and surrendering to darkness was never just physical rest. It was also a moment surrounded by belief, habit, and quiet superstition, because in a time when night felt vast, unpredictable, and uncontrollable, people often searched for small actions that could bring reassurance before sleep. Even the simplest routine could carry meaning. In many homes, the final moments before bed were not silent in a practical sense, but carefully shaped by small rituals. Some people would place objects in specific positions inside the room. A chair slightly turned away from the bed. A tool returned to its exact place. A door checked more than once to ensure it was properly closed, not because disorder was dangerous in itself, but because order created calm, and calm mattered deeply before sleep. There were also beliefs tied directly to protection during the night. In some regions, people avoided leaving shoes facing certain directions, believing it could disturb rest or invite misfortune. Others preferred to keep small objects near the bed, herbs, stones, or simple household items thought to carry protective qualities. These practices varied widely across regions, families, and generations. There was no single system of belief, only patterns passed quietly from one household to another. In some homes, a final glance at the hearth fire was important, not only to ensure safety, but to acknowledge the presence of warmth before darkness fully took over. Letting the fire burn down too suddenly felt unsettling, almost like inviting the night too quickly, so embers were watched carefully, sometimes stirred one last time, sometimes covered in ash in a controlled way that allowed slow, safe fading. Even sound played a role in nighttime superstition. A sudden noise outside, a branch against wood, a distant animal call, the shifting of wind through narrow gaps, could be interpreted in many ways. People learned to distinguish normal night sounds from unusual ones, though imagination often filled in the gaps when uncertainty arose. Children, especially, were often guided gently through bedtime routines that included comforting words or familiar phrases repeated nightly. These were not always formal prayers, but simple expressions of reassurance learned within the family, a reminder that the home was safe, that the night would pass, that morning would return. In wealthier households, superstition sometimes blended with luxury. Soft fabrics, arranged objects, and carefully maintained sleeping spaces were believed to contribute to peaceful rest. Even the arrangement of curtains or the position of candles could be adjusted based on tradition or personal belief. In monasteries, nighttime practices were more structured and disciplined. Silence itself became part of the ritual. Movement was limited. Thought was guided by repetition and prayer. Sleep was not only rest, it was a transition carefully framed by order, but across all classes, one idea remained consistent: night was powerful, and it required acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement was simple, even if it was only a pause before lying down. In rural homes, superstition often blended with practical life. A farmer might check tools near the door before sleep, not only for security, but because leaving them disordered felt wrong in a deeper, almost instinctive way. A mother might adjust blankets carefully over sleeping children while silently repeating familiar protective thoughts learned long ago. These actions were rarely questioned, they were simply part of life. Over time, they created a rhythm, a sequence of small, familiar steps that marked the transition from day to night, and perhaps that rhythm mattered more than the beliefs themselves. Because medieval nights could feel uncertain, the world beyond the walls was dark, wide, and unpredictable. Without modern lighting or immediate communication, anything that provided emotional stability became valuable, even symbolic actions, even small rituals, and so people carried them forward, not always because they fully understood them, but because they worked in a quiet psychological way. They made sleep feel safer, they made the night feel less empty, and as households settled into darkness, these final gestures created a soft boundary between waking life and rest, a closing of the day, a quiet agreement with the night, and then silence, not sudden, but gradual. The kind of silence that forms when everything has been placed, checked, and settled into its proper place. Outside, the medieval world continued its slow, unseen movement. Inside, people finally allowed themselves to drift into sleep, carried not only by exhaustion, but by ritual. And in the next chapter, we move from belief into something far more physical and unavoidable: how medieval people actually slept through illness, discomfort, and the constant presence of sickness in everyday life. When the last light disappeared from the medieval sky, night did not arrive as silence. It arrived as sound, not loud sound, not constant sound, but a layered, shifting presence that filled the darkness in ways people became deeply familiar with over time. Inside homes, the first sounds were always the smallest, the soft settling of wood as the structure cooled, the faint crack of a dying hearth shifting into ash, a blanket adjusting as someone turned in their sleep. These were the sounds of a house slowly letting go of the day, and then, beyond the walls, the world began to speak more clearly. Wind moved through narrow streets, slipping between buildings and around corners, producing low, uneven tones that changed depending on direction and strength. Sometimes it sounded like a distant hum, sometimes like a soft, uneven breath moving through the village. People listened to it without thinking. It became part of background awareness. Animals added their own layer, a dog barking once in the distance, then stopping abruptly. Horses shifting inside stables, their movement echoing faintly through wooden structures. Chickens settling into silence after restless repositioning. Even the smallest rustle of wildlife outside the settlement contributed to the sense that the night was never fully empty. In rural areas, the sounds were even more pronounced. Forests carried movement that could not always be identified. Branches creaked under unseen pressure. Leaves rustled without visible cause. Owls called sharply, their voices cutting through stillness in sudden bursts before fading again into quiet. These sounds were not necessarily feared at every moment. They were recognized, understood as part of the natural rhythm of night. Inside medieval homes, people learned to interpret these layers without needing to fully analyze them. A familiar dog bark meant nothing unusual. A shifting animal in the barn was routine. A sudden silence after wind could feel more noticeable than the wind itself, and yet, sound also carried emotional weight, because in darkness, sound replaced sight. It became the primary way people understood their surroundings. Even the smallest noise could feel amplified when visibility disappeared. A wooden beam creaking might briefly draw attention. A distant sound on a road might cause a pause in conversation before sleep resumed. Not because danger was always present, but because awareness remained heightened. In towns and cities, nighttime sounds were more complex, water flowing through drainage channels, footsteps on uneven stone, doors closing at irregular intervals. Occasionally, distant voices from late travelers or night workers moving carefully through dim streets. These sounds rarely lasted long, they came and went in fragments, and that fragmentation shaped how people experienced night. It was not a continuous landscape of noise, but a series of brief, isolated moments. In monasteries, the soundscape was very different. Silence was intentional, structured, footsteps were controlled. Movement was minimal. Even breathing felt more noticeable in the absence of other sounds. The occasional prayer or soft chant marked time in an otherwise quiet environment. This contrast made monastery nights feel almost suspended, detached from the rest of the world. In castles, sound carried differently again. Stone corridors echoed faintly with movement from guards, servants, or distant rooms. Large chambers amplified even small noises, fabric shifting, doors opening, or footsteps crossing stone floors. Despite wealth and structure, silence was never complete, because sound always found a way through, and in peasant homes, sound was the closest thing to a map of the night. People could tell where animals were, whether wind had changed direction, whether rain had begun to fall, whether someone nearby had woken briefly and then returned to sleep. Sound created orientation in darkness. It helped people understand space they could not see. It also influenced sleep itself. Sudden noises could wake a light sleeper. Familiar sounds could deepen rest. Repeated patterns, like wind against a wall or distant animal calls, often became background rhythm that the mind eventually stopped actively processing. In this way, medieval nights were not silent at all. They were structured by sound, but not structured in a predictable, controlled way. Instead, they were organic, natural, ever-changing, and people adapted to that unpredictability over time. Children grew up learning which sounds mattered and which could be ignored. Adults developed instinctive awareness of changes in their environment simply through listening. Entire households became sensitive to the language of night, and yet, despite all these layers of sound, there were moments when everything aligned into near silence, wind stopping, animals resting, fires fully extinguished. Movement paused. In those rare moments, the absence of sound itself became noticeable, almost heavy, almost unreal, because in the medieval world, true silence was not the default, it was an event, and as night continued, sound slowly returned again, small, subtle, familiar, until it once more became the background of sleep, a reminder that even in darkness, the world was never truly still, it was only quieter. Before sleep in the medieval world, there was never a true separation between clothing and survival. What people wore at night was not chosen for comfort in the modern sense, it was chosen for warmth, for protection, for endurance against cold that returned every evening with quiet certainty. In most medieval homes, sleep did not involve changing into dedicated nightwear. Instead, people often slept in the same garments they wore during the day, especially during colder months. Wool was the most common material, and for good reason. It trapped heat, it resisted wind, it held warmth close to the body long after firelight faded. A simple wool tunic or underdress could mean the difference between restless sleep and tolerable rest during winter nights. Over this, people added layers, cloaks, shawls, or additional wraps were draped over the body before lying down. The more layers, the better the insulation against cold air creeping through wooden walls or stone gaps. Even in sleep, clothing became a form of architecture, a structure built around the body. But wool was not soft in the way modern fabrics are understood. It could feel rough against skin. It could itch during long nights. It absorbed smoke from hearth fires and carried it into bedding and blankets over time. Yet despite these discomforts, it remained essential, because warmth mattered more than texture. Blankets played an even more important role. Thick wool blankets were among the most valuable household items in medieval life. They were heavy, dense, and often hand-woven with great effort. Some households owned only a few, and they were carefully maintained, repaired, and reused for many years. At night, these blankets were layered carefully over sleeping bodies. One was never enough in winter. 2 or 3 were common when available. The weight of them was not just physical comfort, it was protection against cold air that seeped relentlessly through every part of a home. In wealthier households, bedding could include finer materials, linen sheets beneath heavier wool coverings, feather-filled blankets for additional insulation, even imported fabrics in rare cases. But even here, warmth was still the primary concern, not luxury, and despite differences in wealth, one reality remained consistent: night air was colder than anyone could fully prepare for in peasant homes. Blankets were often shared. Families slept close together under layered coverings, combining body heat with fabric insulation. Children were placed in the center of sleeping arrangements during harsh winters to maximize warmth retention. Clothing also served a protective function beyond temperature. It helped guard against insects that lived within bedding, fleas, lice, and other pests that thrived in the same environments where people slept. Layers of fabric could reduce exposure slightly, though never eliminate it entirely. Still, people adapted. They shook out clothing before sleep when possible. They kept garments near fires to dry them after long days in damp weather. They mended tears quickly to prevent further wear. Every piece of clothing had to work harder than it would in modern life, because nothing was easily replaced. In monasteries, night clothing followed a more uniform pattern. Wool garments were simple and consistent, designed for both humility and practicality. Monks often slept in the same robes they wore during daily routines, adjusting only slightly for comfort. In castles, nobles had access to more garments, but the principle remained the same. Layering was essential. Even fine clothing was not immune to cold stone chambers. Servants sometimes prepared bedding by placing warm stones beneath blankets or brushing fabrics before use to soften them slightly. But regardless of class, everyone faced the same night. Cold entered every home. It moved through walls, floors, and ceilings without preference, and clothing was the first line of defense. Over time, medieval people developed an instinct for layering based on season and temperature. They understood which garments worked best together, which fabrics held warmth longer, which combinations allowed for the most restful sleep. It was not scientific knowledge, it was lived experience, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Even children learned early how to pull blankets close, how to adjust clothing before sleep, how to stay warm without disturbing others in shared beds, and in that repetition, clothing became more than fabric, it became habit, comfort, security. As night deepened, wool blankets absorbed the warmth of bodies slowly, creating small pockets of heat that lasted only as long as movement remained still. The moment someone shifted, cold air would slip in again, reminding them of the world outside the bedding, but as long as sleep held steady, warmth remained, and in those quiet hours between dusk and dawn, layered clothing and heavy blankets created the fragile boundary between human warmth and winter's silence, a boundary that had to be rebuilt every single night. In the medieval world, sleep was never treated as something purely physical, it was also emotional, spiritual, and sometimes uncertain, because falling asleep meant surrendering control to the night. And in a time when illness, discomfort, and unexplained restlessness were common, people often turned to the natural world around them for reassurance, not in a scientific sense, but in a practical, lived one. Herbs became one of the most trusted companions of nighttime life. Simple plants, gathered from gardens, fields, and forest edges, were used in quiet ways before sleep. Some were placed near beds. Others were carried in small bundles. A few were burned gently in hearth embers. Releasing soft scents into enclosed rooms, lavender was especially valued for its calming fragrance. Its scent drifted through wooden interiors and stone chambers, mixing with smoke and fabric to create a softer atmosphere at night. People believed it helped settle the mind, even if they could not explain why. Mint, rosemary, and chamomile were also commonly used in various regions. Not always for the same purpose, but often connected to ideas of balance, calmness, or protection from uneasy dreams. In some households, dried herbs were tucked beneath pillows or woven into small cloth sachets placed near sleeping areas. The belief was not that these plants controlled sleep directly, but that they influenced the quality of rest in subtle, unseen ways. Sleep itself was sometimes seen as a vulnerable state, a moment when the body was open to imbalance, illness, or disturbance, so herbs were not just comfort, they were reassurance, a way of shaping the environment into something gentler before surrendering to darkness. In wealthier homes, herbal preparations could be more elaborate. Oils infused with plant extracts were sometimes applied lightly to bedding or clothing. Rooms might be aired with carefully chosen scents before bedtime. Servants responsible for chambers often maintained small collections of dried herbs specifically for nighttime use, but even in the simplest cottages, people found ways to use what they had: a handful of dried leaves, a plant gathered earlier in the season, a sprig placed near the hearth. Nothing needed to be complex to feel meaningful. Alongside herbs, sleep beliefs were deeply woven into medieval life. Dreams were often taken seriously, not always as predictions of the future, but as reflections of inner experience, memory, or spiritual influence. A disturbing dream might be seen as a sign of imbalance, while a peaceful dream was sometimes interpreted as reassurance. Because of this, people often took small steps before sleep to influence what they might experience during the night. Some avoided certain thoughts or conversations before bedtime. Others repeated familiar phrases or prayers to calm the mind. In some regions, people believed that the position in which a person slept could affect their dreams or the quality of rest. Sleep was not passive, it was something to prepare for. In monasteries, sleep beliefs were more structured. Rest was part of a disciplined rhythm of life, and mental calm before sleep was considered important for spiritual clarity. Silence, prayer, and simplicity shaped nighttime routines in carefully repeated patterns. Even there, herbs occasionally played a role, not as decoration, but as part of the environment. Simple plants could be present in dormitories or nearby spaces, adding faint natural scent to stone halls. In rural homes, herbal knowledge was often passed through generations. Mothers taught children which plants were safe, which were calming, and which were simply familiar. This knowledge was not written in books for most people, it lived in memory and practice, and it was deeply tied to seasons. In summer, herbs were fresh and abundant. In winter, they were dried and carefully preserved, sometimes lasting months into colder seasons when access to nature was limited. This cycle gave herbs a sense of continuity across the year. A connection between seasons, homes, and sleep itself. Yet despite all these practices, sleep in medieval times was never guaranteed to be peaceful. Illness, cold, noise, and discomfort often interrupted rest. Herbs and beliefs did not eliminate these challenges. They only softened them. They created small moments of comfort within a larger reality that remained unpredictable, and perhaps that was their true purpose. Not control, but calm, a sense that even in a world without certainty, there were still ways to prepare the mind and body for rest. As night deepened and homes grew quiet, faint herbal scents lingered in the air, barely noticeable, but present enough to soften the edges of darkness. And slowly, sleep arrived, not as something perfect, but as something supported, carried gently by habit, belief, and the quiet strength of simple plants. In the medieval world, sleep was not always a single, continuous stretch of darkness and rest. It often came in fragments, interrupted, divided by the natural rhythms of the body, the environment, and the conditions of everyday life. People did not expect to sleep from sunset to sunrise without waking. For many, waking during the night was normal enough that it was rarely questioned. It was simply how sleep worked. One of the most important reasons for this was the structure of medieval daily life itself. Long hours of physical labor left people exhausted, but exhaustion did not always translate into uninterrupted rest. Bodies that had spent the day in cold, heat, or strain often shifted through stages of deep sleep and lighter wakefulness throughout the night. Inside homes, the environment also played a major role. Fireplaces, which provided essential warmth, gradually cooled after being reduced to embers. As heat faded, the temperature of the room dropped noticeably. This change alone could cause people to wake, adjust blankets, or move closer to others for warmth. Cold was not constant, it was gradual, and sleep responded to it. In many medieval households, especially in rural areas, sleeping spaces were shared. Multiple people in a single bed or room meant that movement was inevitable. One person shifting position, another adjusting clothing, a child waking briefly. These small disturbances naturally broke sleep into lighter phases. Sound also influenced nighttime waking. Even familiar sounds could interrupt rest when heard at the wrong moment in a sleep cycle. A dog barking in the distance. Wind pressing against wooden shutters. A beam creaking as the house settled. These were not necessarily alarming, but they were noticeable enough to pull someone briefly back into awareness, and then there was light, or rather, the absence of it. Medieval nights were profoundly dark. Without artificial lighting, the human body relied heavily on natural cycles of rest. But this also meant that when someone woke during the night, there was no gentle transition between sleep and wakefulness. No soft illumination to orient the mind, just darkness, complete and immediate. This made even brief awakenings feel more significant than they might today. Another important factor was the absence of modern timekeeping. Most people did not measure sleep in hours. They experienced it in cycles: rest, wakefulness, rest again. In some regions and historical accounts, people even described a pattern of first sleep and second sleep, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between. During these waking intervals, people did not always remain in bed. Some would tend to small tasks. Others might sit near the hearth, adjusting embers or simply resting in silence. Some prayed quietly. Others reflected on dreams or the events of the day. In this way, nighttime wakefulness became part of daily rhythm rather than disruption. In monasteries, this pattern was even more structured. Wakefulness during the night could be connected to prayer cycles or silent reflection. The environment encouraged calm alertness rather than disorientation. In castles and noble homes, waking during the night often involved subtle awareness of surroundings, servants moving quietly through corridors, distant footsteps echoing through stone halls, or the occasional sound from outside the chamber windows. Even in wealthier settings, uninterrupted sleep was not guaranteed. The human body itself also played a role. Without modern understanding of sleep science, people simply lived through natural fluctuations in sleep depth. Periods of lighter sleep made waking more likely, especially in environments that were not fully insulated from noise, temperature change, or movement. Illness or discomfort could also interrupt sleep frequently. A fever, a cough, or simple physical pain could cause repeated waking throughout the night. In colder seasons, stiff joints or cold limbs made rest less stable, leading to more frequent adjustments and partial awakenings. And yet, despite all of this, medieval people did not necessarily view nighttime waking as a problem. It was expected, part of the natural structure of life, because the goal of sleep was not strict continuity, but restoration. Rest happened even in fragments. What mattered was the overall rhythm of the night, not its uninterrupted flow. Over time, people adapted to this pattern. They learned not to panic when waking in darkness. They understood that stillness would return. They became comfortable with the quiet space between sleeps, whether it lasted minutes or longer, and often, these moments of wakefulness became strangely peaceful. The house was quiet, the fire dim, the world reduced to a small circle of awareness, breathing, warmth, and stillness. Then, without effort, sleep would return again, as if it had never fully left. In this way, medieval nights were not a single continuous experience, but a gentle cycle of awareness and rest shaped by environment, habit, and the limits of human life at the time. In the medieval world, sleep did not end when the body closed its eyes. For many people, it only shifted into another kind of experience. Dreams were not treated as meaningless fragments of imagination. They were something closer to messages, uncertain, symbolic, sometimes comforting, and sometimes unsettling in ways that lingered long after waking. A dream could feel like a continuation of life, just separated by darkness, and because of that, people paid attention to them, not always with fear, not always with certainty, but with curiosity shaped by belief, tradition, and the need to find meaning in experiences that could not be easily explained. When someone woke from a vivid dream in a medieval home, the silence around them often felt different for a moment. The fire might have dimmed further. The room might feel colder. Shadows might seem unfamiliar for just a few seconds before the mind fully returned to waking life. Dreams did not always stay in the mind quietly, they lingered. In villages, people often spoke about dreams in the morning. Not in loud discussion, but in small conversations shared with family members while preparing for the day. A dream of water might be discussed differently from a dream of travel. A dream of illness might be remembered longer than a dream of simple daily life. There was no single interpretation system shared by everyone. Instead, meaning came from a mixture of religion, local tradition, and personal reflection. In many Christian communities of medieval Europe, dreams were sometimes viewed as reflections of the soul's condition. Not always predictions, but signs that could be considered thoughtfully. A peaceful dream might be seen as comfort. A disturbing one might be taken as a reminder to reflect or pray, but interpretation was never absolute. It depended on context, emotion, and the person experiencing it. In monasteries, dreams were often treated with caution. Monks were encouraged to focus less on symbolic meaning and more on spiritual discipline. Dreams were acknowledged, but not always analyzed deeply, as excessive focus on them could distract from daily devotion and structured thought. Still, even in disciplined environments, dreams could not be ignored entirely. They were part of human experience. In rural life, dreams often blended naturally with the rhythm of physical labor and daily survival. After long days of work, people's sleep was often deep but fragmented, and dreams could feel especially vivid when rest was irregular or interrupted. A farmer might dream of fields, sometimes familiar, sometimes distorted. A craftsman might dream of tools or unfinished work. A mother might dream of children, home, or distant journeys. These images were not always interpreted as messages, but they were rarely dismissed completely, because dreams felt personal, intimate, connected to lived experience. Some beliefs held that dreams could be influenced by the state of the body or environment before sleep. Heavy meals, illness, cold weather, or emotional stress were all thought to affect the nature of dreams. This created a natural connection between daily life and nighttime imagination. Herbs used before sleep, scents in the room, or even the position of the body were sometimes believed to shape dream quality. These ideas were not uniform, but they reflected a broader medieval understanding that sleep and waking life were deeply connected. Dreams were not separate from reality, they were part of its continuation, and because of that, people often remembered them more clearly than we might expect today. A dream could remain in memory throughout the day, influencing mood, conversation, or reflection. In some cases, dreams were shared more widely in communities, especially if they felt unusual or emotionally significant. People might seek guidance from elders or religious figures, not necessarily for fixed answers, but for reassurance or perspective, yet most dreams remained private, quiet, kept within the individual mind, and in many ways, that privacy made them more powerful, because in the silence of night, dreams had no audience, only the dreamer. As sleep continued through the medieval night, dreams came and went in cycles, sometimes remembered, sometimes forgotten immediately upon waking. The boundary between imagination and meaning was never fully defined, and that uncertainty gave dreams a lasting presence in medieval thought. Even in morning light, when the world returned to clarity, traces of dreams sometimes remained. A feeling without clear origin. A memory without structure. A sense that something had been experienced, even if it could not be fully described, and so dreams became part of medieval life in a quiet but persistent way, not as fixed truths, but as possibilities, reflections, whispers of the mind during its most vulnerable hours. In the medieval world, fire was both comfort and threat. By day, it meant cooking, warmth, and survival. By night, it became something more fragile. Something that had to be watched even while the body tried to rest, because a single flame, left unchecked in a wooden home, could turn quiet sleep into disaster, and everyone knew it. As evening settled and households prepared for sleep, the hearth was carefully reduced rather than fully extinguished in many places. Embers were left glowing beneath ash, small and controlled, providing just enough warmth to carry into the night. But this quiet glow carried responsibility. Fire did not sleep, it continued to breathe slowly even when people did. Inside wooden cottages, beams, thatch roofs, and dried materials made every structure vulnerable. Walls absorbed heat easily. Smoke could gather in enclosed spaces. And if a flame grew beyond control, there were no quick systems to stop it, no alarms, no emergency response, only people waking up in time, or not waking up at all, so nighttime fire became a shared concern in every household. Before lying down, people often checked the hearth one final time. Not in panic, but in habit shaped by experience. Wood was arranged carefully. Ash was spread to reduce oxygen. Flames were lowered until they became steady, quiet embers rather than active fire. Even small mistakes could matter. A stray spark landing on dry straw bedding, a fallen ember rolling too close to wooden flooring, a gust of wind slipping through cracks and briefly feeding a flame. These were not rare fears, they were understood risks, and so awareness of fire never fully disappeared, even during sleep. In peasant homes, the fireplace was often central to the entire living space. It was used for cooking, heating, and light. At night, this same fire became both protector and potential danger. Families slept nearby because warmth was necessary, but proximity also meant constant awareness. Sometimes, water or sand was kept close by, and not as formal firefighting tools, but as simple precautions. Buckets, clay vessels, or stored containers of liquid could be used if something went wrong. Still, prevention was the only real protection. In wealthier homes and castles, fire safety was more structured, but not foolproof. Large halls and chambers still relied on open flames for lighting. Torches, candles, and hearths were spread throughout stone interiors. Servants were often responsible for monitoring fires even during late hours, but accidents still happened. Wax could drip, candles could fall, smoke could accumulate in enclosed corridors. Stone reduced risk, but did not eliminate it. In monasteries, fire was used more sparingly, yet even there it remained essential for light and warmth. Monks moved carefully through dark corridors carrying candles or lamps, always aware of how quickly flame could spread if neglected. Nighttime fire management became part of discipline itself, a quiet responsibility embedded into routine. Outside, entire villages shared a collective awareness of fire risk. A single house catching flame in the night could threaten neighboring structures, especially when buildings were close together or connected by shared wooden elements. Wind could turn a small accident into something far larger, and so people often remained lightly aware even in sleep. Not fully alert, but not entirely disconnected either. Sounds from the hearth, shifts in temperature, or unusual smells could wake someone quickly. This was not anxiety in the modern sense, it was practical vigilance. A learned awareness passed through generations, and yet, despite its danger, fire remained essential. Without it, medieval nights would have been far more severe, colder, darker, and less survivable. People accepted the risk because they needed the benefit. Warmth outweighed fear. Every night became a balance between comfort and caution. As households settled into sleep, the final glow of embers cast faint, shifting light across wooden walls. Shadows softened. Sounds faded. The fire, though reduced, still existed as a quiet presence in the room, alive, but controlled, and in that fragile state, homes drifted into darkness carefully. With trust placed in small routines that had been repeated for centuries, morning would reveal whether that trust held. Most nights, it did, but everyone knew that it did not always have to. In the medieval world, night did not always end in silence. Even after the fires were lowered and the blankets were pulled close, there was often a final layer of human sound before sleep fully arrived. Quiet conversations, soft, unhurried, and unimportant in the way only nighttime thoughts can be. These were not formal discussions. They were not debates or decisions. They were fragments of speech exchanged in low voices, shared between people who were already half drifting into rest. Inside small cottages, families often lay close together in the same room, sometimes even the same bed. There was no separation of space like in modern homes. Privacy existed only in tone and intention. And so words became softer, slower, more careful. A parent might ask if a child was warm enough under the blankets. A sibling might whisper about something seen earlier in the day. Someone might mention the weather, or tomorrow's work, or nothing meaningful at all, just small reflections that floated between wakefulness and sleep. These conversations were not meant to last, they were meant to fade. In many homes, speech naturally decreased as the night deepened. Sentences became shorter. Pauses became longer. Eventually, words were replaced by silence without any clear ending, but that silence was not immediate, it was gradual, like embers cooling in a hearth, in peasant households. These final conversations often carried a practical tone. A reminder to rise early. A note about feeding animals. A brief mention of tools or tasks waiting for morning light. Life in medieval times was tightly connected to daily labor, and even bedtime carried traces of responsibility. Still, there was gentleness in it, not urgency, just awareness. In wealthier homes, nighttime conversation could take a slightly different form. In castle chambers or noble rooms, voices might linger a bit longer, especially among family members or attendants who remained nearby. The scale of life was larger, but the night still softened everything. Even status could not fully resist sleep. Monasteries, by contrast, treated night speech as something to be minimized. Silence was part of discipline. But even there, brief exchanges sometimes occurred in low tones, practical, necessary, and quickly concluded. After that, silence returned, structured and intentional, across all settings. However, one pattern remained consistent: night reduced language. Not suddenly, but steadily, because the body itself began to pull attention inward. Words required effort. Thought slowed. And conversation naturally dissolved into quieter forms of presence. Sometimes, people did not even finish sentences. A half-formed thought would be met with a soft response, or simply acknowledged with silence. Understanding did not always require completion. In many ways, these moments were more emotional than structured speech during the day. Without daylight urgency, conversation became softer and more personal, even when it was about ordinary things: a memory shared briefly, a concern expressed without elaboration, a small comfort offered in return. These exchanges helped ease the transition into sleep. They created a sense of closeness that did not need to last long to feel meaningful, and then, slowly, speech would stop entirely, not because someone decided it should, but because it simply faded. Breathing became the dominant sound. Fabric shifting. Fire settling. The world outside continuing its distant, unseen movement. Inside, awareness narrowed, thoughts loosened, sleep approached quietly, without announcement. In some homes, there was a final habit before complete silence: a whispered phrase, a final acknowledgement, or a soft goodnight exchanged without formality. Not universal, but common enough to feel like part of the rhythm of the night. After that, nothing more needed to be said, because words had done their job. They had carried the mind from activity into rest, and as sleep finally arrived, conversations dissolved into the background of memory, leaving only stillness behind, not emptiness, but completion. In the medieval world, morning did not arrive gently. It arrived with sound, movement, and obligation. Even before the sky fully brightened, the day often began in a way that pulled people out of sleep rather than allowing them to drift into it naturally. For many, especially in towns and near monasteries, the first sign of morning was not sunlight, it was bells, distant at first, then clearer as they carried through cold air and stone structures. The sound marked the transition from night to day with a kind of authority that could not be ignored. In monastic life, bells were especially important. They structured the entire rhythm of existence. Night prayers, early services, and morning routines were all guided by their sound. When they rang, monks rose from simple beds, stepping into dim corridors where silence slowly gave way to purpose. There was no hesitation. The sound itself created movement. In villages and rural homes, the experience was slightly different but still deeply shaped by early rising. Even without formal bells, people often woke before sunrise out of habit, necessity, or the demands of daily labor. Agriculture did not wait for comfort. Animals needed care, fields required attention, food preparation began early to maximize daylight hours. So mornings often started in darkness or near darkness, long before the sun made its presence fully known. Inside homes, the first movements of the day were small but deliberate. People would sit up slowly in bedding still warm from sleep, adjusting clothing that had been worn through the night. Cold air that had settled during the hours of rest now felt sharper against skin. Fires, if they had not gone out completely, were revived. This was one of the first tasks of the morning in many households. Rekindling embers required patience and familiarity. A small breath of flame had to be encouraged back into life. gradually restoring warmth and light to the space. Until that moment, mornings often felt and finished dim, suspended between night and day. As fire returned, so did activity. Water was fetched, if available nearby. Simple washing took place where possible, hands, face, sometimes feet. Not in the modern sense of bathing routines, but enough to mark the transition into the day ahead. Clothing shifted from sleepwear or layered night garments into more structured daytime attire. Even though many people slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, adjustments were still made to prepare for work outside the home. In wealthier homes, mornings were more structured. Servants prepared chambers, refreshed bedding, and tended to household fires. Bells from nearby churches or town centers reinforced the sense that the day had formally begun. Time was not measured in hours as precisely as it is today. It was measured in moments, sound, light, activity. In monasteries, early rising was not optional. It was discipline. The day began before sunrise with prayer and silence, often in cold stone environments where breath could be seen in the air. Movement was minimal, deliberate, and aligned with ritual structure. For everyone, regardless of status, mornings required adjustment from sleep to responsibility. There was no gradual easing into the day as in modern life. Instead, there was transition, clear and immediate, but even with its demands. Early morning carried a certain clarity. After the fragmentation of sleep, the unpredictability of dreams, and the stillness of night, morning brought structure again. Tasks were defined. Roles resumed. The world became legible once more, and in that clarity, people moved forward. Outside, villages slowly came alive. Smoke rose from chimneys as fires were rekindled across homes. Doors opened. Animals were led out. Footsteps began to appear on paths that had been empty only hours before. The transformation was gradual but consistent. Night receded, day returned. When we look back at medieval nights, it is easy to imagine them as simple, dark, quiet, empty, but for the people who actually lived them, night was never empty. It was full of presence, not always loud presence, but layered presence. The sound of wind moving through wooden homes, the warmth of shared bodies under heavy blankets, the faint glow of embers fighting against cold, and the steady rhythm of sleep broken into fragments and returns. Night was not a pause in life. It was part of it, and in many ways, it shaped medieval existence as much as daylight did, because when the sun disappeared, people did not simply stop living. They adjusted. They narrowed their world to what could be felt, heard, or imagined within the limits of darkness. A bed was not just a place of rest, it was a small protected space in a large uncertain world, sometimes surrounded by curtains, sometimes shared with family, sometimes warmed by animals or heated stones. Always shaped by effort, habit, and adaptation, sleep itself was not the smooth, uninterrupted experience we often assume today. It came in cycles. It was interrupted by cold, by sound, by illness, by simple human awareness that never fully switched off. People woke during the night. They adjusted blankets. They listened to the house breathe. They checked fires. They returned to sleep again, and this repetition was not seen as failure. It was normal, even expected, because medieval life was built on rhythms that did not always match modern ideas of comfort or continuity. Fire had to be managed carefully. Too much and it risked danger. Too little and it brought cold. Animals shared space with humans. Herbs and beliefs shaped atmosphere. Clothing and blankets formed layers of survival rather than luxury. Even dreams were part of the night's landscape, sometimes remembered, sometimes discussed in the morning, sometimes quietly forgotten but still felt, and through all of it, people endured, not with resistance alone, but with adaptation. That is perhaps the most overlooked truth about medieval nights. They were not defined by suffering, they were defined by adjustment, a constant, quiet negotiation between comfort and necessity, between fear and familiarity, between darkness and the small points of light that people created for themselves. Inside homes, life did not stop after sunset, it simply changed form. Conversations became softer. Movements became slower. Sounds became more meaningful. Even silence carried weight, shaped by awareness of everything it contained and everything it did not. And when morning came again, whether through bells, light, or habit, it did not erase the night, it simply replaced it, led it over with structure, activity, and sound once more. But traces of night always remained, in tired eyes, in slow movements, in the quiet memory of waking in darkness and returning to sleep again. Medieval nights, when viewed closely, were not distant or alien. They were deeply human, full of small routines that still echo in modern sleep in subtle ways, waking briefly, adjusting position, listening to the environment before drifting back into rest. The difference is not that people then slept differently in spirit, but that their world around sleep was more visible, more present, less hidden behind insulation, technology, and artificial light. And perhaps that is why studying medieval nights feels strangely calming, because beneath the discomforts and limitations, there was a rhythm, a steady one. Night came, life softened, sleep arrived in pieces, and morning always returned, not perfectly, not comfortably, but reliably enough for life to continue. And in that continuity, people found their balance. So when we think of medieval nights now, we are not just looking at darkness. We are looking at a world learning how to rest within it, and that quiet effort, to sleep, to endure, to continue, connects them to us more than we might first realize. Because even across centuries, night is still night, and sleep, in all its forms, is still one of the most human things we share.